Welcome, everyone, to the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural National Historic Site special virtual presentation, The Many Lives of a House, A History of the Ansley Wilcox House by Edie Wallace, an independent historian. This project was a collaborative effort of the National Park Service and the Organization of American Historians, and I would like to take a moment to thank both of those great and near and dear institutions. Thank you for your support. My name is Spencer Morgan, and I am the executive director for the Theodore Roosevelt site here in Buffalo, New York. Since we will be discussing the entire history of the site, we now know as the TR Inaugural site, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and to honor the sovereignty of the Six Nations, Seneca, Tuscarora, Cayuga, Oneida, Onondaga, and Mohawk, and their land on which we are situated and doing our work today. We want to demonstrate respect for the treaties that were made on these territories and express our remorse for the harms and mistakes of the past. We acknowledge that we were founded upon the exclusions and displacement and erasures of the indigenous peoples who resided here when we arrived and who still reside on these lands today. We encourage everyone to join us as we take the time to learn more about our collective history and connect with indigenous communities. We respect our nation-to-nation relationships and the responsibilities we have to one another. While we know a land acknowledgement is not enough, it is an important social justice and decolonial practice that promotes indigenous visibility and is a reminder that we are settled on indigenous land. It is incumbent upon us, those currently residing on this stolen land, to take action and begin the difficult conversations with our indigenous neighbors that need to take place with the spirit of respect, reconciliation, and collaboration. I also wanted to take a moment to thank you all for joining us this week when we are celebrating our Legacy Day. For those who don't know, September 14th is a significant date in the history of America and in Buffalo in particular. September 14th, this weekend, marks the 123rd anniversary of the death of President William McKinley here in Buffalo as a result of an assassination, and the inauguration of his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, here at 641 Delaware Avenue, Buffalo, New York. We have a number of events planned to commemorate this momentous day, including a Pan-American specific double-decker bus tour with a stop to the Buffalo History Museum this Saturday. The frock coat Theodore Roosevelt was wearing is also on display here at the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site now through Sunday, September 15th. We will also be doing a special commemoration this Friday at Canisius High School, where we will be unveiling the newly restored Milbourne Home historic marker, marking the spot and the anniversary of President McKinley's death. More information on these and other upcoming events can be found at trsite.org. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Edie Wallace. Edith B. Wallace is an independent historian specializing in American social and architectural history. Ms. Wallace has a Master of Arts degree in Historic Preservation from Goucher College, Baltimore, Maryland, where she received the 2003 Hiram McCullough Award for her thesis on preserving African American historic resources in rural Washington County, Maryland. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree in Anthropology from the University of Delaware. Ms. Wallace led historical research and context development services for Paula S. Reed and Associates Incorporated in Hagerstown, Maryland, from 1998 through 2018. She is a founding member and past president of the Friends of Tolson's Chapel, dedicated to the preservation and interpretation of Tolson's Chapel and School in Sharpsburg, Maryland. Just a housekeeping item, following the presentation, we will have a Q&A session where Edie will be able to answer your questions. Please be sure to mute yourselves if you're not already muted. And please feel free to place any questions you have in the Zoom chat box, and we will answer those questions at the end of the session. Now, I'm going to turn the session over to Edie Wallace. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen so you all can see my presentation. Here we go. Bear with me. All right. welcome and thank you all for joining me tonight for this presentation. I have a lot to cover, so I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to begin with the purpose of a historic resource study, or HRS. The HRS is used to inform decisions about the preservation, management, and interpretation of historic cultural resource sites within, I'm sorry, it's something is covering my, within the national park system. Let me see if I can move this. It provides a narrative history of the site, embracing social, political, cultural, and economic themes that contribute to the site's significance, while providing accurate baseline information that will place the I'm so sorry. The extant cultural resources of the park within larger historical and geographic contexts. So what are the cultural resources at Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural National Historic Site? They include the house, the reconstructed carriage house that is now the visitor center, the furnishings, books, and other objects in the library, office, and morning room, the archaeological collections, as well as archival collections. The national significance of the Ansley Wilcox House, which I call the site, rests upon the singular occasion of the September 14, 1901 inauguration of Theodore Roosevelt. But in a larger sense, the history of the site highlights important periods of cultural and material change in America that are addressed as thematic threads throughout the study. Many of these changes were the catalysts that led men like Theodore Roosevelt and Ansley Wilcox to their lives of public service. Three of the themes within the study relate directly to the Wilcox House and its history, including military history of the Niagara region and the significance of the Buffalo Barracks, Theodore Roosevelt's connection and friendship with Ansley Wilcox, and the important social and civic improvements they championed, and the long fight to save the Wilcox House and how it paralleled the evolution of historic preservation in the U.S. The added depth of information and discussion will aid in interpretive planning around these themes. But there are additional themes included as part of the wider context, and these include the pre- and post-colonial Native American history of the land on which Buffalo later grew, African Americans in Buffalo, and the affluence in the Gilded Age as it is revealed in the Wilcox House and its juxtaposition to the industrial, largely immigrant working class of Buffalo and other urban centers. These three themes are important interpretive opportunities for the park, as each one can be addressed through the lens of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency and or the various occupants of the Wilcox House. So briefly, some of the research methods that I used. This study benefited from the large amount of primary and secondary research conducted by members of the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society, now known as the Buffalo History Museum, and the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site Foundation, located at the site. I also made use of the large number of digital archives now available, including the Library of Congress, National Archives, New York Public Library, the New York State Library, New York Heritage, Ancestry, Family Search, newspapers.com, Google Books, archives.org, and the Hathi Trust. All were invaluable resources. And many of the images you will see tonight are examples of these many resources that I used to research this study. So let's jump right in. I like to begin an HRS with the geologic history of and around the site, which often determines the use of the site through human history. Here, the formation of the lakes by glacial activity influenced the use of the area by Native American groups and later by European traders and colonizers, and determined the development of the Buffalo settlement into a shipping, commercial, and industrial center that supported both the affluent and the working class as Buffalo transformed into a thriving lakeside port city. While Chapter 1 of the HRS delves into the prehistoric presence of indigenous groups, in the interest of time, this presentation will fast forward to the period of European contact with Native peoples. In 1612 and 1632, French explorer Champlain identified the Neutral Nation, an Iroquoian language group, possibly Erie, along the Niagara River, between the warring Huron and the Iroquois Confederacy, known as Haudenosaunee, or Five Nations. And the Neutral Nation I have circled here in red. In 1655, the Seneca defeated the Neutrals, pushing them west across the river, and claimed their former territory encompassing Buffalo Creek, primarily used as a hunting ground. The Seneca, one of the Five Nations, were the keepers of the western door, while the Mohawks, the keepers of the eastern door, held ground against the Dutch New Netherlands colony, centered on the island of Manhattan. That was formerly Lenape territory, now occupied by Dutch settlers, including the Roosevelt family, who arrived in 1649. Eventually, the Seneca themselves would be pushed from much of their territory by former British colonials after the War for Independence, in which the Seneca allied with the British. The large swath of land reserved to the Seneca by the U.S. Treaty of 1794 was quote unquote sold by the Seneca in 1796 to Robert Morris, who then conveyed the land to the Holland Land Company. And that land sale is shown here on this map. The 3 million acres were surveyed for subdivision and sale by company surveyors, including Joseph Ellicott. This very simplified summary of a very complex history is salient to interpretation at the site, not only as context to the development of Buffalo, but also to the long history of Native removal and oppression in the face of U.S. expansion, a government policy that continued to some extent under President Theodore Roosevelt's tenure. By 1794, a white trader named Cornelius Winnie had an Indian trading post and tavern near the mouth of Buffalo Creek. With him was Black Joe Hodge, who had escaped enslavement to live among the Seneca around 1780, and by 1794 worked as Winnie's interpreter and business partner. Winnie's Buffalo Creek establishment attracted others to the location, and by 1795, the little village close to the lake had 4 or 5 houses and an inn where it was said, quote, nothing could be had, end quote. Holland Land Company surveyor Joseph Ellicott found a larger village in 1799 when he described it with, quote, mechanics, tavern keepers, and merchants, end quote. He determined to build his Lake Erie port town there, platting it in 1801, and this is the plat on the screen. The plan overlaid several of the earlier village buildings on Buffalo Creek that you see at the bottom of the picture. Though Ellicott called his town New Amsterdam, the name Buffalo was the one that stuck. Lot sales began in 1804, and in 1806, Ebenezer Walden purchased a town center lot becoming the first attorney to settle in Buffalo, designated the Niagara County seat in 1808. In 1809, Walden purchased Lot 52, a 46-acre parcel located on higher ground well north of the town center, which became known as Walden Hill. And I'll just note here that the Wilcox house sits on part of Lot 52 on Walden Hill. By 1810, more than 1,500 people lived in Buffalo. With the start of hostilities with England in 1812, the border with British Canada along the Niagara River from Buffalo to Fort Niagara saw an influx of up to 4,000 troops, and these were both New York troops, militia, and U.S. troops. The town of Buffalo was destroyed by a fire in 1813, started by British troops in retaliation for a similar incident perpetrated by U.S. troops across the border. Buffalo was quickly rebuilt, largely with brick for fire safety, and harbor improvements had begun by 1816. Talk of building a canal across New York State to Lake Ontario or Lake Erie started as early as 1808, and in 1816, construction began. Buffalo was chosen as the terminus of the Grand Canal in 1819, and the canal, renamed the Erie Canal, was finished in 1825, cementing the Port of Buffalo's dominance in Great Lakes shipping between the expanding U.S. territories and eastern ports. Growth in commerce, industry, and population followed suit. In 1820, Buffalo's population numbered over 2,100, including 7 enslaved people and 24 free Blacks. By 1825, the year the canal was completed, the population had more than doubled to over 5,800, including many Irish immigrant canal construction workers. The 1830s saw enormous growth in Buffalo. Industry blossomed along the hydraulic canal, shown here, in the city's east side, where immigrant laborers, by then increasingly German-speaking, lived in tenement communities. A growing class of wealthy industrialists and merchants built large residences around the expanding commercial center. Real estate speculation fueled a building boom of commercial buildings, many constructed by Benjamin Rathbun, whose investment fraud scheme brought his ruin and that of many of his investors. Ebenezer Walden held a mortgage on part of Lot 52 from an 1835 pass-through sale to Rathbun. On the block located on Delaware, North, and Main Streets, and an alley called Waverly Place. Walden recovered the tract after he sued the bankrupt Rathbun over the debt. Rathbun's speculative ruin came as a national financial crisis unfolded beginning in 1837. While a number of Buffalo's elite lost their fortunes to the crisis, it was the laboring poor in Buffalo who suffered most with job loss, hunger, and displacement. In 1835, the population of Buffalo had grown to more than 15,000 residents, including nearly 400 African Americans, all free since the end of New York gradual emancipation in 1827. Many were likely freedom seekers who had traveled the Underground Railroad from slave states to Buffalo en route to nearby Canada. Notable among them, William Wells Brown, who wrote a narrative of his escape and his time living in Buffalo. In 1837, the border with Canada again brought conflict to Buffalo as Canada's Patriots' War spilled across the Niagara River just north of the city. Though the war was brief, it brought the U.S. Second Artillery Regiment to Buffalo in 1838, with more troops expected to come. Construction of the Buffalo Barracks, known locally as the Poinsett Barracks, after then Secretary of War James Poinsett, began in 1839, located on Walden Hill on part of Lot 52, under a 5-year lease from Ebenezer Walden. The central parade ground was surrounded by soldiers' quarters and officers' quarters, which looked the same as the soldiers' quarters, but were divided into apartments. And there were 2 guardhouses at the gate and other support structures. The center building, let me see here, the center building here was a full story higher than the rest of the barracks buildings, constructed with 8 rooms. The center building was divided into 2 4-room apartments by late 1840. Oh, I apologize here. I've lost my way. Over the 6 years the U.S. Army occupied the barracks, the officers and troops never faced conflict on the border. Instead, the soldiers spent their time practicing drills on the barracks parade grounds, artillery practice on a nearby field, and entertaining locals with music, competitions, and parades. Officers mixed with the elite of Buffalo in an active social scene, and several even married daughters of prominent men. The barracks population peaked at 569 men and 130 women and children in October 1840. By June 1845, just 210 men and 14 officers remained. The Buffalo Barracks were abandoned in September 1845 as U.S. troops were repositioned in preparation for the looming war with Mexico. As per the lease agreement, the barracks buildings were sold and demolished in 1846, prior to the 18-acre lot's return to Ebenezer Walden. The major's quarters were not demolished, perhaps at Walden's request. And on September 22, 1847, Walden sold a subdivided parcel of Lot 52 with the building on it to Joseph and Christina Masten for $3,500. In testament to the continued growth of Buffalo, the remaining barracks property was sold at auction in 1848 and divided into 75 lots. It is within the former major's quarters that Theodore Roosevelt will be inaugurated as U.S. president in 1901. Of course, that's still decades away from where we are, but we will get there. From 1847 through 1901, the building changed hands 7 times. Most of the owners were men of wealth with positions in government, law, industry, and commerce. Their wealth and status placed these men, their wives, and children at the center of Buffalo society, their lives ruled by Victorian ideals of behavior. Just a few blocks to the south and east, Buffalo's immigrant and African-American residents, who formed the bulk of the city's laboring class, worked on canal boats and lake steamers, in the grain elevators, livestock processing, the expanding iron and steel industries, on the railroads, and in the numerous breweries and tanneries in the city. Men and women filled the ranks of the domestic servants working in the homes of the city's upper-class families, while children also labored to help support their families. And this is a house from the east side. The juxtaposition of the mansion house on Delaware Avenue with the nearby east side neighborhoods reveals the deepening class divide within the U.S., as the country grappled with territorial expansion, immigration, civil war, and the post-war period of economic exuberance known as the Gilded Age. The first of the post-barracks owners, Joseph and Christina Masten, called their new estate Chestnut Lawn. With the barracks buildings cleared away, their expansive park-like lawn, which was part of the former parade ground, stretched the full block from Delaware to Franklin Street. By 1856, when this map was drawn, Masten had enlarged the former major's quarters with several additions on the west side, on the Delaware Avenue side, and an east front toward Franklin Street portico. Masten came to Buffalo in 1836 as a young lawyer. A Democrat, he was elected mayor of Buffalo in 1843 and again in 1845, promising to reduce city debt and support a common school system. He was elected judge of the Recorder's Court from 1848 to 1856, when he was elected to the Superior Court. Judge Masten served as vice president of the Council for the Medical College of Buffalo, today's University of Buffalo, while Christina Masten sat on the women's board of the Buffalo Orphans Asylum. Both were active in Buffalo's elite social groups and events. In 1850, the Masten household included Joseph, Christina, their two children, Joseph's mother and brother, as well as 3 foreign-born house and ground servants. Buffalo's population numbered more than 42,000 people in 1850, with nearly half of that number said to be German immigrants. Judge Masten actively invested in real estate, and it was perhaps in the wake of the Panic of 1857 that his mortgage debt on the Chestnut Lawn estate forced his sale of the property to the Oliver Lee and Company's Bank of Buffalo for $32,500. Oliver Lee had established his Buffalo Bank in 1843, then died of a heart attack in 1846. Though the bank continued to operate, speculating in real estate and rental properties, the bank's unfortunate choice to purchase the Chestnut Lawn estate in June 1857 came just 2 months before the start of the nationwide financial panic. 1 month later, the bank was declared insolvent. Chestnut Lawn probably remained vacant until its sale at public auction in 1859. At the time of sale, the estate had been subdivided into 6 lots, one including the elegant establishment recently owned and occupied by the Honorable Joseph G. Masten. When the local newspaper listed the purchasers of the various properties, the name G.L. Wilson appeared on 5 of the 6 Masten lots. At the time of his purchases in 1859, Gilbert L. Wilson was employed as the treasurer for the New York Central Railroad, then consolidating several independent railroads running between Albany and Buffalo, with an eye to reach the territories beyond the Great Lakes. Wilson purchased the lots, which were deeded in his name, intending to reconvey them to the New York Central ownership. His personal life, however, would force a delay of that conveyance. Wilson was a lawyer who specialized in financial law. In 1855, while working for the New York Central Railroad, Wilson was appointed the sole executor and trustee of the large estate of John C. Spencer, former Secretary of War and Secretary of the Treasury under President John Tyler. In June 1861, he married Cora Livingston Barnard, and 13 days later died after falling out of a 3rd-story window, an apparent suicide. He was said to be depressed from personal financial losses, but later speculation implied he had mishandled the Spencer estate, but the truth remains unknown. 9 days after his death, Wilson's father and widow, conveyed the former Masten estate to the railroad company. In May 1863, the New York Central divided the Masten property in half, one lot fronting on Franklin Street and the other, including the house, fronting on Delaware Street. Albert P. Lanning purchased the Delaware Street house and lot, which by then had likely been vacant for 6 years. Lanning was a successful attorney who moved to Buffalo with his wife Esther and 2 daughters in 1856. After he bought the Masten house in 1863, Lanning undertook a 2-year renovation. He reversed the aspect of the house to front on Delaware Avenue, removing additions made by Masten to the old major's quarters on the west side, and added his own, including the Greek temple-like west front portico. The formal entrance of the old building acquired an elegance befitting the status of the Lanning family as they settled into the affluent neighborhood developing along Delaware Avenue. Like Judge Masten, Lanning was affiliated with the Democratic Party. Elected in 1857 to represent the 1st District of now Erie County in the New York State Assembly, he was described as, quote, bold as a lion, end quote, supporting labor interests and opposing bank monopolies. During the Civil War, Lanning supported the Union as a Copperhead Democrat, speaking at meetings to boost New York troop recruitment for the U.S. Army. Still, he believed Lincoln had overstepped his powers, particularly with the Emancipation Proclamation. Campaigning in 1864 for presidential candidate and Copperhead Democrat George B. McClellan, he spoke on the issue of slavery, saying, quote, "The Democratic Party will never return a slave to bondage. Neither will it sanction a war waged simply for the purpose of extermination of slavery, not because it favors slavery, but because such a war renders the restoration of the Union under the Constitution hopeless," end quote. Albert P. Lanning remained active in politics after the war and continued his work as a corporate lawyer. He was active in church and municipal roles and was appointed by the New York Senate to serve on the Construction Commission for the City and County Hall in Buffalo, which is still standing. In 1870, his household included his wife and daughter, 2 domestic servants, and a coachman, all Irish-born, and a St. Bernard dog. Lanning had a new carriage house constructed on the property about 1877. Today, that carriage house is evidenced archaeologically as a foundation underground. Following his death in 1880, Lanning was fondly remembered by his peers, including Judge L.L. Lewis, who described him as, quote, "an able lawyer, an accomplished gentleman, an upright citizen, a kind and affectionate husband and father, and a true friend," end quote, and a good Victorian man. In 1881, his surviving daughter and widow sold the Delaware Avenue house to Frederick A. Bell. Fred Bell was singular among other owners of the house in that he was not a lawyer, not a philanthropist, and not a family man. Bell had arrived in Buffalo in 1878, a wealthy young bachelor with a reputation for lavish parties at the hotel in which he lived. He was a successful coal merchant, leading the Pennsylvania firm of Bell, Lewis, and Yates. Fred Bell purchased the elegant mansion house, which I assume he would have considered it, on Delaware Avenue in 1881, shortly after his marriage to Mary Gridley. It was Mary's second marriage following a divorce. Even after the couple moved into their new home, Bell reportedly maintained, quote, a suite of apartments at the Genesee Hotel, where he entertained his friends in regal fashion, end quote. Not surprisingly, the Bells separated in 1882 and divorced in 1883, Mrs. Bell claiming domestic infelicity. After his divorce, Fred Bell expanded his social connections and industrial portfolio in Buffalo. In 1885, he was a founding member of the Americas Club, a men's social club, and in 1886, he was vice president of the Gentlemen's Driving Club, a men's carriage and horse racing group. Among his industrial pursuits, Bell was a founding trustee of the Buffalo Wood Vulcanizing Company, was incorporator and president of the International Elevating Company and Lakeshore Elevator Company, both of which built a large grain elevator. When he died in 1900, his estate was valued at $25 million, much of which went to his ex-wife, Mary Gridley Bell. Fred and Mary Bell had sold their Delaware Avenue house shortly after their divorce in 1883 to Fred's father, Alfred Bell. Alfred Bell quickly sold the property in November of 1883 to Dexter Rumsey, a wealthy Buffalo businessman. Rumsey then presented the mansion house as a life estate wedding gift to his youngest daughter, Mary Grace, shown on the right, following her marriage to Ansley Wilcox 1 week earlier. Wilcox was the widower of Cornelia Nellie Rumsey, shown on the left, Grace's older sister, who had died in 1880, just 6 weeks after the birth of their daughter, Cornelia Nina Wilcox. Ansley and Grace had bonded over administering Nellie's estate and her help caring for Ansley's infant daughter, Nina. And on November 20th, 1883, they were married in a quiet ceremony. The following week, they settled into their new house on Delaware Avenue to raise young Nina, shown on the right. In 1884, their daughter Frances was born. Ansley Wilcox was born in 1856 in Georgia. His father was a wealthy Connecticut merchant and his father a Georgia plantation belle. In 1865, the family escaped the war in the South and moved to Connecticut, where Ansley attended Yale College, then spent a year in England at Oxford University, where he met the vacationing Rumsey family. In 1878, Ansley moved to Buffalo to practice law. He specialized in corporate law and from 1883 to 85 served as an advisory counsel for the governor-appointed commission acquiring land for the New York State Reservation at Niagara Falls. In 1891, he argued for before the U.S. Supreme Court in Briggs versus Spalding to hold members of corporate boards responsible for actions that damaged the corporation they oversaw. In Rogers versus City of Buffalo, Wilcox successfully established the constitutionality of the civil service law in Buffalo, a subject he would pursue for much of his life. In 1895, Ansley and Grace Wilcox engaged architect George Carey to design new additions to the historic mansion befitting their growing status. In all that they did, Ansley and Grace fulfilled the expectations of upper-class families during the Gilded Age. Both were active in the Buffalo elite social scene, attending charity balls, playing golf together at the Buffalo Country Club, and participating in horticultural club events. Grace was a patroness for charity events and a member of the Erie County Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. She was a founding director of the 20th Century Club in 1894, a women's social club, and their building is still standing on Delaware Avenue. And for many years, she hosted The Class, a women's literary group formed by Frances Wolcott in the 1890s. In 1899, Grace traveled to France and Italy with Nina and Francis for an 8-month European education. They spent summers at the Althorpe family estate on Lakeshore Road, where many of Buffalo's affluent families escaped the city's summer heat. Nearby was the Winnetka Country Club, of which Ansley Wilcox was a founding member. Ansley held leadership positions from 1878 to 1916 as a member of the charity organization Society of Buffalo, an umbrella charity group formed to direct assistance to the poor. He was appointed to the board of managers of the state reformatory at Elmira, was a trustee of the Buffalo General Hospital, and a member of the Buffalo Historical Society. Among his social memberships were the Young Men's Association, the Buffalo Club, and the Liberal Club, all men's private clubs. Although it is hard to imagine that Wilcox had free time outside of his other interests, he also loved horses, keeping his riding horses and polo ponies in a stable behind the house, and reportedly rode in the park almost every morning. So how is it that Theodore Roosevelt would come to know Ansley Wilcox well enough to eventually be inaugurated President of the United States in the Wilcox family library? Well, the two men shared remarkably parallel personal experiences in their early years before they intersected over their social and political reform activities. Ansley was just 2 years older than Theodore, who was born in 1858. Both were born less than 5 years before the American Civil War. Each had a Northern father who was a businessman backed by family wealth. They both had a Southern mother who was wealthy by birth and nurtured within the Southern culture of enslaved labor. Both families ultimately lived in the North, the Wilcox family landing in Connecticut after fleeing the South during the war, and the Roosevelt family already living in New York City. In the 1870s, Wilcox attended Yale College and Oxford University, while young Roosevelt had traveled across Europe before completing his studies at Harvard. Both were married by the age of 22. Wilcox to Cornelia Rumsey, 1878, and Roosevelt to Alice Lee in 1880, and both became young widowers following the deaths of Cornelia and Alice, each soon after giving birth to a daughter. Both men married and continued to advance their careers, Wilcox in law and Roosevelt in politics, that led them toward shared goals in the progressive reforms of the late 19th century. But I expect their personal experiences also was a connection for them. The US in the late 19th century was a land of extremes. The opportunities afforded to upper-class men like Theodore Roosevelt and Ansley Wilcox stood in stark contrast with the struggles of the laboring class. While wealth remained almost exclusively in the hands of white men, the nation's laborers, most of them European immigrant and African Americans, remained desperately poor. The growth of industry and consolidation of capital widened the gap between rich and poor. The financial panics of the 1870s and 1890s, well as corporate efficiencies and greed, pushed laboring families deeper into poverty and advanced the labor union movement. The progressive reform movement of the 1890s was in response to these growing problems, largely in urban settings like Buffalo and New York City. The movement was populated by affluent men like Wilcox and Roosevelt, who felt a moral responsibility to alleviate class and political inequities, but also by men and women who fought for other changes like temperance, women's suffrage, and labor unions. Both men began their reform efforts in the state of New York. Wilcox largely at the municipal level in Buffalo, and Roosevelt as a young state assemblyman from New York City, and then as governor of New York. But it was Theodore Roosevelt who would bring major elements of the progressive movement to the White House in 1901. While Wilcox and Roosevelt may have heard each other's names as they worked separately toward the preservation of Niagara Falls, Ansley as the counsel to the New York Reservation Committee, and Roosevelt as state representative, rallying support for the land reservation. But the two men's interests also intersected over civil service reform, though again in separate arenas. Roosevelt labored within the New York Assembly against his own party's interest to support reform with New York Governor Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, here signing the Civil Service Reform Bill from Harper's Weekly. Wilcox worked toward reform in Buffalo and with the National Civil Service Reform League. After Wilcox supported Roosevelt's run for governor of New York in 1898, Roosevelt appointed him to the Board of Managers to improve conditions at the Elmira State Reformatory, and later appointed him as commissioner to oversee the investigation of District Attorney Asa Bird Gardner of New York County. In this letter from Roosevelt to Wilcox, dated December 23, 1899, Roosevelt wrote, quote, "I appointed you because I felt that in the entire state, there was no man upon whose capacity, integrity, fearlessness, and judgment I could better rely than upon yourself," end quote. Throughout Roosevelt's first term as governor of New York, he and Wilcox corresponded and met for personal meetings. Wilcox referred inquiries and requests to the governor and made recommendations for commission and judgeship appointments. In December 1899, Wilcox invited Roosevelt to be a guest at the annual Saturn dinner to honor George Washington's birthday, to which Roosevelt agreed. And it was Wilcox who offered the toast to his friend, Mr. Theodore Roosevelt. In June 1900, Roosevelt was nominated to run for vice president on the Republican ticket with incumbent President William McKinley. As governor, Roosevelt was unpopular with New York State Republican Party leaders who disliked his independent progressive agenda. And with this nomination, they reportedly hoped to remove him from New York State politics. Colonel Theodore Roosevelt was by then the popular Rough Riders hero of the 1898 Spanish-American War and was aligned with McKinley's policy toward Cuba, Hawaii, and the Philippines. But National Republican Party leader Senator Mark Hanna also feared Roosevelt's independent reputation, remarking before the convention, quote, "Don't any of you realize there's only one life between this madman and the presidency?" End quote. McKinley was reelected with Roosevelt as his vice president. The patriotic pride and sense of destiny that had swept the Republicans to victory was celebrated at the Pan American Exposition held in Buffalo in 1901. When Vice President Roosevelt spoke at the May 1901 opening dedication in place of McKinley, whose wife was ill, he softened the imperialist rhetoric, emphasizing prosperity through cooperation. President McKinley made his appearance in September 1901, where he was met with large crowds and pageantry. On September 5th, Leon Czolgosz fired 2 shots into the president's torso as McKinley reached out to shake the young man's hand. McKinley was treated for his wounds at the Milburn residence on Delaware Avenue, while Roosevelt stayed nearby at the Wilcox house for several days. As the president seemed to be recovering, Roosevelt left for a family vacation. On September 12th, the president suddenly worsened and died on the 14th. Roosevelt arrived several hours later, now President of the United States, just as Senator Hanna had feared. Just after 3 p.m. on September 14, 1901, a small group of solemn men and women filed into the library of the Wilcox family home on Delaware Avenue. Their purpose was to witness the inauguration of Theodore Roosevelt as the 26th President of the United States. The ceremony was hurried and unplanned, lasting only a few minutes. As Ansley Wilcox recalled a year later, quote, "It takes less in the way of ceremony to make a president in this country than it does to make a king of England or any monarchy. But the significance of the event is no less great," end quote. It was only the 5th such midterm inauguration to occur in the US, one of 3 resulting from an assassin's bullet, and just the 2nd to be held in a private home outside of Washington, D.C. There would be others in the future, but this one, happening at the turn of the new century and installing a young president with bold ideas for the future of the U.S. at home and abroad, would mark the beginning of a new era for the country and the presidency. And I'm going to quickly bring this presentation to a close with a few notes about the preservation of the Ansley Wilcox house. Despite its obvious significance in U.S. history, like the Milburn House where President McKinley died, the Wilcox House was threatened by urban development. But while the Milburn House was eventually demolished, the Wilcox House survived, in part because it remained in use for many years as a restaurant, but also because of a strong coalition of people dedicated to its preservation to honor Theodore Roosevelt and his extraordinary presidency. Many thanks who persevered, and to the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site Foundation that now administers and interprets the Wilcox House in partnership with the National Park Service. Thank you all for listening, and I believe that we will move on to questions.
In July, we had over 2,000 visitors alone, and talking about September 14th, 1901 specifically, while giving people the opportunity to ask questions about the history of the site through rotating galleries or through more investigation through our touchscreen exhibits and on our website. There's a lot of more information there, but this site does have such a deep and interesting history. And it's a perfect example about preservation advocacy, about national designation, about what it means to become a national park site. But that history is American history, a true American history. And I just want to thank you, Edie, for really talking about everybody's stories as part of this, stories that we don't get the opportunity to talk about in an hour-long docent-led tour here at the site, but giving us the opportunity to tell the stories of everyone who called this site home at one point in time. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. And I believe, I mean, there is no way, it is a big report, and there's no way I could share everything in less than an hour. But the National Park Service typically makes these studies available eventually online. And the Organization of American Historians does too. So anybody that wants to dive in and get the whole story, it should be available.
Thank you for that. We'll keep our eyes out, and please be sure to follow us again on social media, join our listserv, because when we do have access to that report in a digital format, we will be sure to share that with our audience, both virtually and in person too. We have a couple copies, but honestly, to be able to talk about how big this study is, it's amazing what you accomplished, Edie. And thank you so much. With that, I think we have no more questions. So I just want to thank you all again for joining us this evening. I know we have a presidential debate tonight, so this is very on topic with both our legacy week here and the issues we face as a nation this year in 2024, as we did in 1901. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. Good night, and thank you for your time.
Okay.
Thank you, Edie.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Edie.